The old galleon emerged from the mist like a phantom, its weathered hull and tattered sails defying time itself. Captain James Blackwood stood on the dock, his calloused hand clutching the brass key that had arrived with news of his inheritance. 40 years at sea hadn't prepared him for this moment, facing his father's legendary vessel, long thought lost to the depths. The harbour folk whispered of curses and strange lights seen aboard the empty ship at night. James knew better than to heed superstition, yet something about the ship's silent presence made his spine stiffen. What secrets did the rotting timbers hold about his father's final voyage? What would he discover in the darkness below deck that even the bravest sailors feared to name? Artifact: the weathered journal, a salt-stained logbook containing the father's final entries, revealing his obsession with a mysterious island and growing paranoia about his crew. The weathered boards of the dock creaked beneath James Blackwood's boots as he approached the gangplank of the Redemption. 63 years had etched deep lines around his eyes, evidence of decades squinting against harsh sun and salt spray. His once auburn hair had faded to silver, pulled back in a tight queue that revealed a jagged scar along his temple, a souvenir from the Battle of Madagascar 30 years prior. "You sure about this, Captain?" Thomas Hollis, his most loyal crewman of 20 years, stood at his side. The younger man's face betrayed the concern his respectful tone attempted to mask. "I faced the Spanish Armada and survived the Devil's Triangle, Thomas. I think I can manage boarding my own inheritance," James replied, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of a man who'd spent a lifetime shouting orders above howling winds. Yet something about this vessel made his weathered heart quicken. The ship, his father's legendary vessel, had appeared in harbour 3 days ago, empty of crew but somehow anchored perfectly in the deepest channel. The same ship rumoured to have disappeared with all hands some 40 years prior. The harbour master had delivered the brass key and documents 2 days ago. By rights of blood and law, the vessel Redemption returns to the Blackwood line, the official papers had declared. No explanation of where it had been all these years, or how it had arrived unmanned. James had spent his entire adult life denying his father's legacy, building his own reputation as a merchant captain of impeccable standing, though few knew the early fortune that established his respectable business had come from less reputable ventures in his youth. His father, the infamous Captain Edmund Blackwood, had been a name that struck fear in shipping lanes from Port Royal to Madagascar. "The Butcher of Barbados," they'd called him. "They say no one's managed to stay aboard past sunset," Thomas whispered, eyeing the ship with undisguised apprehension. "Harbour-master sent 3 men to secure her, found them huddled in a rowboat at dawn, white as sheets, refusing to speak of what they'd seen." "Superstitious nonsense," James muttered, though he felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from the ship's darkened portholes. The gangplank felt unusually cold beneath his palm as James began his ascent. Each step brought memories he'd long suppressed. His father's rare visits home, smelling of rum and gunpowder, bringing exotic treasures and terrifying tales. The gleam in Edmund's eye when he'd promised, "Someday, boy, you'll sail with me, and I'll show you wonders that would make the king himself weep with envy." That day never came. By James' 16th birthday, the Redemption had vanished, taking Edmund Blackwood and his secrets to the depths. Or so everyone had believed. The main deck was immaculate, unnervingly so for a ship that had supposedly been adrift for decades. No debris, no sign of neglect beyond the weathering one would expect. The wood seemed to hum beneath his boots, almost as if the vessel recognized his blood. "We should check the captain's quarters first," James decided, the brass key heavy in his pocket. "Thomas, secure the main deck." "Aye, Captain," Thomas answered, but his voice betrayed his unease. "Will you be wanting me to accompany you below?" James considered the offer. Pride demanded he face his father's ghost alone, but practicality suggested otherwise. Before he could answer, a low creaking echoed from below decks, the distinct sound of a door swinging on rusted hinges. Both men froze. "Did you hear that?" Thomas whispered. "The settling of an old ship," James replied, more to convince himself than his companion. Nothing more. The ship suddenly lurched, though the harbour waters remained glassy calm. From the corner of his eye, James could have sworn he saw movement in the rigging, a shadow passing too quickly to identify. "Check the moorings," he ordered Thomas, gripping the hilt of his sword from long-established habit. "I'll start below." As he descended the stairs to the lower deck, the air grew noticeably colder. The lantern he carried cast twisted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. His father's quarters would be at the stern, the largest cabin, as befitted a captain of Edmund Blackwood's reputation. The brass key slid into the lock as if it belonged there. As the door swung open, the scent hit him first. Parchment, ink, and something else, something sweet yet metallic, like blood mixed with honeyed rum. Artifact, the ancient map. A partially burned parchment, revealing an uncharted island, with strange markings and warnings in a language James doesn't recognize. The captain's quarters were a study in controlled chaos. Charts and maps covered nearly every surface, held down by an assortment of navigational tools and curious trinkets from ports James himself had only heard whispered about in tavern tales. The furniture was bolted to the floor, standard for any seagoing vessel, but the craftsmanship spoke of wealth and influence far beyond what James had believed. His father possessed. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface obscured by stacks of ledgers and loose papers. Behind it hung a portrait James had never seen before. His father, younger than James remembered him, standing proudly beside a woman whose face had been deliberately slashed from the canvas. His mother? Edmund had never spoken of her, and James had learned early not to ask. "Captain," Thomas called from above. "Moorings are secure, but there's something odd. The ropes, they're brand new. Not a day of weathering on them." "Acknowledged," James called back, his eyes fixed on the desk. There, prominently displayed atop the scattered papers, lay a leather-bound journal. Its cover was stained with what appeared to be both seawater and darker, rust-colored splotches. Blood. James had seen enough of it in his time to recognize it even decades later. With careful hands, he lifted the journal and opened to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable, his father's bold, slashing script, an educated hand that had always seemed at odds with the man's brutal reputation. "Final log of the redemption," the first entry read, dated 40 years prior. "We have found it at last. The island appears on no chart, just as the Portuguese wretch promised, before I slit his throat. The men grow restless. They signed for plunder, not for this expedition. Matters not. What awaits us on those shores will make kings of us all, or condemn us to damnation eternal." James flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. The entries became increasingly erratic, spanning several weeks. His father wrote of an ancient temple, of treasures beyond imagining, but also of strange occurrences aboard the ship. Whispers in the night, men found staring blankly at the sea. Tools and weapons moved from where they'd been left. The final entry chilled James to the bone. "They are turning against me. My own crew, my own blood. I see it in their eyes. The island has marked them somehow, changed them. But I am so close to understanding the secret. The artifact pulses stronger with each passing night. I hear its voice now, clearer than any human tongue. It promises power unimaginable, but demands sacrifice. Tonight I make my choice. God forgive me for what I am about to do." The journal ended abruptly, the remaining pages blank, save for a single page near the back. There, pinned with a small dagger, was a partial map, its edges burned as if someone had tried to destroy it. The landmass it depicted matched no coastline James recognized from his extensive travels, and the markings around it were in no language he had ever encountered. "Found something, Captain?" Thomas appeared at the doorway, his usual confidence subdued by the oppressive atmosphere of the quarters. "My father's journal," James replied, not looking up from the weathered pages. "The last entries before the ship disappeared. And he found something. Something he'd been searching for his entire life, it seems." James traced his finger over the strange map. An island, a temple, some kind of artifact. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. With respect, Captain, whatever your father was hunting, it didn't end well for him or his crew. Perhaps we should. A sudden crash from above cut him short. Both men tensed, hands moving instinctively to their weapons. I secured everything on deck, Thomas whispered, eyes wide. There was nothing that could have fallen. James closed the journal, tucking it into his coat. Let's investigate, together. As they moved toward the stairs, the temperature in the cabin plummeted. James's breath fogged before his face, despite the warm Caribbean evening. The lantern flame guttered, nearly extinguishing, then flared unnaturally bright for a moment. In that brief illumination, James could have sworn he saw writing appear on the wall behind the desk, flowing script that vanished as quickly as it had manifested. Ascending to the main deck, they found a belaying pin lying in the center of the otherwise immaculate planking. This was secured in the rail, Thomas said, pointing to an empty holder several yards away. Someone or something removed it. Ships settle, James said firmly. Objects fall. Objects don't move across decks on their own, Thomas countered. His voice tight. Before James could respond, a low moan echoed through the ship, not the natural creaking of timbers, but something distinctly human in its misery. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Tell me you heard that," Thomas whispered. James nodded, his weathered face grim. "The crew quarters. Below. That's where we need to go next." Artifact, the bone flute. A small musical instrument carved from human bone, emitting haunting melodies when the ship rocks, believed to call lost souls back from the sea. The narrow passageway to the crew quarters stretched before them like a throat leading to the belly of a beast. James lifted his lantern higher, the yellow light barely penetrating the unnatural darkness ahead. The air grew thick, carrying the scent of salt, rot, and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded James of the embalming houses he'd once visited in Port Royal. "Stay close," James murmured to Thomas, drawing his pistol. The familiar weight of the weapon brought little comfort. What good were bullets against whatever haunted this ship? Their footsteps echoed hollowly on the wooden planks. With each step deeper into the vessel, James felt as though unseen eyes tracked their movement. Twice he turned sharply, certain he'd glimpsed a shadow darting at the edge of his vision, only to find empty air. "Captain," Thomas whispered, his voice strained. "Listen." James paused, holding his breath. At first he heard nothing beyond the gentle creak of the ship. Then it came, faint but unmistakable, the soft notes of a flute playing a melody that raised the hairs on his neck. It was a sea shanty he recognized, the dying sailor's lament, but distorted somehow, the timing wrong. Notes held too long or cut too short. "There shouldn't be anyone else aboard," Thomas said, voicing what they both knew. "And yet," James replied grimly, "the music led them to the crew's quarters, a long, low room filled with hammocks swaying gently, despite the ship's stillness in the harbor. The melody grew louder as they entered, seeming to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. There, Thomas pointed with a shaking hand. In the farthest hammock, something moved. Not the gentle sway of empty canvas, but the deliberate motion of weight shifting. James raised his pistol, advancing slowly. The music stopped abruptly, leaving a silence more terrifying than the ethereal melody had been. "Show yourself," James commanded, his captain's voice steady despite the fear clawing at his throat. The hammock stilled. For 3 heartbeats nothing moved. Then a soft thump sounded as something fell to the deck beneath the hammock. James approached cautiously, Thomas at his back, until his lantern illuminated the fallen object. A flute, no longer than his hand, carved from what appeared to be bone. Not animal bone. The curve and thickness suggested a human radius, polished to an ivory gleam and decorated with intricate carvings of waves and strange symbols that matched those on the partial map. "Don't touch it," Thomas warned, but James was already kneeling. Drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain, the bone was warm to the touch, as if recently played. As his fingers closed around it, the ship groaned around them. Timbers shifting through the harbour remained calm. The flute seemed to vibrate in response. "This belonged to him," James said with inexplicable certainty. "To my father," Thomas shook his head. "Captain Blackwood was many things, but I never heard tell of him being a musician." "There was much about my father I never knew," James replied, tucking the bone flute into his coat beside the journal. "What happened here, Thomas? What happened to the Redemption and her crew?" Before Thomas could answer, a violent shudder ran through the ship. The lantern swung wildly, shadows dancing across the walls like frenzied spirits. And in that chaotic moment, James saw them, glimpses of men in the hammocks, transparent as morning fog, their faces contorted in silent screams, bodies twisted at impossible angles. Then, as suddenly as it began, the shuddering stopped. The apparitions, if they had ever been there, vanished. The hammocks hung empty once more. "Tell me you saw that," James whispered. Thomas's ashen face was answer enough. "We need to leave this accursed ship, Captain, now." James shook his head, a strange calm settling over him. "I can't, not yet. There's more to find. My father's secrets. I need to understand what happened here." "Whatever happened, it's best left buried," Thomas urged, backing toward the doorway. "Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved." James felt the weight of the journal and flute in his coat. "My whole life I've run from his shadow. I've denied our connection, built my reputation as the antithesis of his. But now," he gestured around them, "the past has found me anyway. I need answers, Thomas." A long sigh escaped his first mate. "Then we continue, but not alone." He squared his shoulders, making a visible effort to master his fear. "I'll return to shore, gather a few of our most trusted men. Whatever we face here, we'll need more hands," James nodded. "Agreed, but be discreet. I don't want the entire harbour knowing our business. And you," Thomas asked, concern evident, "will you remain aboard alone?" "I'll be fine," James assured him, though uncertainty gnawed at his confidence. "I've survived worse than a few ghostly tunes and strange noises." As Thomas departed, James couldn't shake the feeling that the ship itself watched him, calculating, measuring his worth for some purpose he couldn't fathom. The bone flute seemed to grow warmer against his chest, and in the distance he could swear he heard its melody begin again, playing of its own accord. Artifact, the captain's compass, a tarnished navigational device that points not north, but toward the mysterious island, growing warmer when pointed in the correct direction. Alone on the Redemption, James returned to his father's quarters, determined to uncover more about the ship's fate. The room felt different now, colder, watchful. The scattered papers on the desk seemed to have shifted, though James knew that was impossible. No one else had been in the cabin. He placed the bone flute carefully on the desk and removed the journal from his coat. In the lantern light, the bloodstains appeared fresher than they should after 40 years. James ran his finger along one particularly large smear, surprised to find it tacky to the touch. "Impossible," he murmured, wiping his finger on a handkerchief. A metallic glint caught his eye from beneath a fallen chart. Pushing the yellowed parchment aside, James revealed an ornate brass compass. Unlike standard navigational instruments, this one featured strange symbols around its perimeter, instead of cardinal directions. The needle, rather than pointing north, spun lazily before settling on a direction that would lead roughly southeast from their current position. When James lifted the compass, he noted its unexpected warmth and substantial weight. Turning it over, he found an inscription on the back in his father's distinctive hand. "Not all treasures are gold. Not all paths lead home." The cryptic message stirred something in James's memory, his father's voice from long ago, speaking those exact words the last time James had seen him. He'd been 16, headstrong and angry, declaring his intention to make his own way rather than follow in the infamous pirate's footsteps. Edmund Blackwood had merely smiled that knowing smile of his and spoken those words before sailing away forever. Or so James had believed. A thud from somewhere deep in the ship jolted him from the memory. James pocketed the compass, which seemed to grow warmer against his thigh, and picked up his lantern. The bone flute he left on the desk. Something about the instrument unsettled him too deeply to keep it close. Moving cautiously, James followed the sound to a narrow doorway he hadn't noticed before. It blended almost seamlessly with the woodwork of the lower deck, the kind of secret passage a smuggler or pirate would value. The door stood slightly ajar now, though James was certain it had been closed earlier. Beyond lay a steep staircase descending into absolute darkness. The air that drifted up carried the unmistakable scent of the deep ocean, that particular mixture of brine, decay, and ancient coldness that James had encountered only in the deepest parts of the sea. The hold, he whispered to himself. Every instinct warned against descending alone, yet he found himself taking the first step, then another. The compass in his pocket grew noticeably warmer, almost hot enough to burn through the fabric of his coat. The wooden steps creaked beneath his weight, each sound magnified in the close confines of the passage. 13 steps down, James reached another door, this one secured with a heavy iron lock. Without conscious thought, he reached for the brass key that had come with his inheritance, the one that had opened the captain's quarters. Somehow he knew it would fit this lock as well. The mechanism turned with a reluctant groan, as if it hadn't been used in decades. When the door swung open, the stench hit him with physical force, the unmistakable odor of death and decay. Impossibly preserved after all these years, James raised his lantern, the light revealing a space far larger than any normal ship's hold should be. The dimensions defied the external size of the vessel, stretching into shadows his light couldn't penetrate. How could such a space exist within the Redemption's hull? Wooden crates and sea chests lined the walls, each secured with chains and locks. In the center of the hold stood a massive iron cage, its bars twisted and bent outward, as if something had forced its way out from within. And everywhere, on the floor, the walls, even the ceiling, strange symbols had been carved or painted. The same unrecognizable language from the map. Some of the markings appeared to have been made in blood. Captain Blackwood. The voice came from behind him, making James whirl around, nearly dropping the lantern. A young sailor stood at the top of the stairs, one of his own crewmen from his merchant vessel. Daniels, what are you doing here? Mr. Hollis sent me ahead, sir. Said you might need assistance while he gathers the others. James nodded, relieved to see a familiar face, despite having ordered Thomas to wait until they could assemble a proper party. Come down, then. There's something here you should see. As Daniels descended, James turned back to survey the hold. The lantern's light caught something shimmering in the far corner, something that reflected the light in a way that made his blood run cold. Water. Seawater pooled on the floor, rippling gently as if disturbed by some recent movement. But the hull was intact. James would have noticed a breach. So how was water entering a sealed compartment? And why did it seem to be flowing not in from the walls, but up through the floorboards? Artifact, the cursed medallion, a gold coin depicting a smiling skull on one side and an ancient temple on the other, always cold to the touch and seemingly absorbing light around it. Stay back from the water, James commanded Daniels, who had reached the bottom of the stairs. The young sailor paused, peering at the dark pool spreading across the hold floor. Is the hull breached, Captain? No, James replied, his eyes fixed on the water's strange movement. No breach. The water rippled again, more purposefully this time, tendrils of it stretching across the wooden planks like questing fingers. James instinctively backed away, putting himself between the phenomenon and his crewmen. What in God's name? Daniels whispered. James didn't answer. The compass in his pocket had grown painfully hot, and he pulled it out to find the needle spinning wildly before fixing itself toward the spreading water. A warning, perhaps, or a direction. He couldn't be sure. We should leave this place, Daniels suggested, his voice tight with fear. Wait for Mr. Hollis and the others. Before James could agree, something glinted beneath the water's surface, a flash of gold that caught the lantern light. Without thinking, He knelt and reached toward it, ignoring Daniel's protests. The water was ice cold, colder than any Caribbean sea had right to be. James's fingers closed around a small, round object, and he withdrew his hand quickly. Resting in his palm was a gold medallion, roughly the size of a Spanish doubloon, but thicker. On one face was etched the image of a grinning skull, more detailed and disturbing than any pirate emblem James had encountered. The other side depicted some kind of stepped temple surrounded by strange glyphs similar to those on the map. Despite just being retrieved from water, the medallion was completely dry. More unnervingly, it felt cold, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to leach the warmth from James's very bones. "Captain, your hand!" Daniels exclaimed. James looked down to see frost forming on his fingers where they touched the coin, spreading slowly up his wrist. With a curse, he dropped the medallion to the floor, where it landed with an unnaturally loud ring that echoed through the hold. The water retreated from the coin as if repelled, sliding back toward the far corner. The medallion itself seemed to absorb the light around it, creating a small halo of darkness on the wooden planks. "Don't touch it," James ordered unnecessarily, rubbing his frozen fingers to restore circulation. "What is it?" Daniels asked, keeping his distance. "I don't know." James knelt to examine the coin without touching it. "But I believe it's what my father was seeking, or part of it. At least." Using a piece of cloth torn from his handkerchief, James carefully picked up the medallion, wrapping it thoroughly before placing it in a small leather pouch at his belt. Even through the layers, he could feel its unnatural coldness. "The writings in my father's journal," he explained to Daniels. "They spoke of an artifact with great power. Something from an uncharted island. You think this coin is that artifact?" James shook his head. "No, but it's connected. A key, perhaps, or a marker." He surveyed the hold once more. "We need to search this place thoroughly, but not alone. And not without preparation." A muffled thud from above made both men look up. "That would be Mr. Hollis returning with the others," Daniel said with evident relief. But James wasn't so sure. The quality of the sound had been wrong somehow. Not the deliberate tread of men boarding the ship, but something more furtive. "Let's go up," he decided, suddenly eager to leave the hold and its impossible dimensions behind. As they turned toward the stairs, the water in the corner surged upward in a spray that reached nearly to the ceiling. Both men froze as the liquid column twisted in midair, forming briefly into a shape that resembled a human torso and head, before collapsing back to the floor with a splash. "Run!" James shouted, shoving Daniels toward the stairs. They took the steps 2 at a time, James slamming the whole door shut behind them and turning the key in the lock. Whether such a barrier would stop whatever was down there, he couldn't guess, but it provided some small comfort. Emerging onto the main deck, they found it empty. No sign of Thomas or the promised reinforcements. The evening had deepened into true night during their time below, and a mist had risen from the harbor, shrouding the ship in ghostly white. "Something's wrong," James muttered, drawing his pistol. "Hollis should have returned by now. Perhaps he had trouble gathering trustworthy men," Daniel suggested. Though his tone lacked conviction, a soft, splashing sound drew their attention to the starboard rail. Something moved in the dark water alongside the ship, something large enough to create a wake that lapped against the hull. "Man the port side," James ordered, moving toward the sound. "If you see anything unusual, call out." As he approached the rail, the medallion in his pouch grew colder, the chill spreading through his hip and down his leg. The compass, still in his hand, vibrated slightly, its needle pointing directly overboard. Leaning cautiously over the edge, James lifted his lantern to illuminate the black water. For a moment he saw nothing. Then a pale face stared back at him from just beneath the surface, a face he recognized from the portrait in the captain's quarters, though now bloated and fish-bitten. With seaweed tangled in its beard, his father's face, eyes wide open and aware, mouth moving as if trying to speak, James recoiled from the rail, nearly dropping his lantern. When he looked again, forcing himself to confront what couldn't possibly be real, the water was empty. Nothing but gentle waves reflecting the lantern light. Artifact, the captain's pendant, a silver amulet containing a lock of hair from Edmund's wife, James's mother. The only item he always wore, now glowing with an unearthly blue light. "Captain?" Daniels called from across the deck. "There's a rowboat approaching." James tore his gaze from the water, still shaken by what he'd seen, or thought he'd seen. Moving to the port side, he peered into the thickening mist. The faint sound of oars cutting through water reached his ears before his eyes could penetrate the gloom. "Ahoy, redemption!" Thomas Hollis's voice carried across the water, bringing a wave of relief. "Ahoy!" James called back. "Approach and identify yourselves." A rowboat materialized from the fog, Thomas at the oars with 3 other men, all trusted members of James's merchant crew. James noted the extra weapons they carried. Muskets, pistols, and cutlasses enough for a small war. "Permission to come aboard, Captain?" Thomas asked, maneuvering alongside the hull. "Granted," James replied, helping secure the boarding ladder. As the men climbed aboard, James noticed their unease. Not just the expected apprehension about boarding a supposedly haunted vessel, but something more immediate. "What happened?" he asked Thomas once all were aboard. "You look as if you've seen a ghost yourself." Thomas exchanged glances with the others before answering. "The harbor's in an uproar, Captain. 3 bodies washed up along the wharf not an hour ago, fishermen who went missing last week. But here's the strange part. They were found clutching medallions exactly as described in your father's old tales. Gold coins with a skull on one side and a temple on the other," James finished, reaching for the pouch at his belt. Thomas's eyes widened. "You found one here?" Before James could answer, a low moan echoed across the deck, the same haunting sound they'd heard earlier from the crew quarters. The new arrivals tensed, hands moving to weapons. "What was that?" asked Morris, the youngest of the newcomers. "The wind in the rigging," James replied firmly, though he knew it was no such thing. "Nothing more." "Captain!" Daniels spoke up, his voice tight with fear. "Look at your coat." James glanced down to find a wet handprint on his sleeve, as if someone had gripped him with a dripping hand. The shape was large, a man's hand, but elongated somehow, the fingers too thin and too long. "The medallion," James said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I need to examine it properly." He turned to the assembled men. "Thomas, secure the deck with the others. Daniels, with me." In the captain's quarters, James carefully unwrapped the coin, placing it on the desk beside the bone flute. Even in the warm lantern light, the metal retained its unnatural coldness, a small circle of condensation forming on the wood beneath it. "I've never seen gold behave this way," Daniels remarked, keeping a respectful distance. "Nor I," James agreed. He removed the compass from his pocket, watching as the needle oriented itself toward the medallion. "These items are connected somehow. And this," he reached into his shirt, drawing out a silver pendant he'd worn for decades, a gift from his father on their last meeting. The oval locket contained a lock of dark hair that James had always assumed belonged to his mother. To his astonishment, the pendant was warm to the touch and emitting a faint blue luminescence. "That's new," he murmured, holding it closer to the medallion. The glow intensified, and the hair within seemed to move of its own accord, coiling like a living thing. "Captain!" Thomas's urgent voice preceded him into the cabin. "You need to come topside, now." The deck was awash in an ethereal light that emanated not from their lanterns, but from the sea itself. The fog had lifted to reveal waters glowing with the same blue radiance as James's pendant. More disturbing still, the glow formed a distinct path leading from the ship out into the open ocean, a luminous trail pointing southeast, the same direction the compass indicated. "It started a few minutes ago," Thomas explained, his usual stoicism shaken. "First just a small patch, then spreading. The harbour folk have noticed too. Look, along the distant wharf, tiny figures could be seen pointing toward the phenomenon, some running, others gathering in groups. We're drawing attention we don't want," James noted grimly. Morris pointed toward the water. "Captain, there's something out there." In the glow, James followed his gesture to see dark shapes moving beneath the luminescent surface, human-like figures swimming just below, circling the ship like predators. "It's time for answers," James decided, clutching the pendant which now pulsed in rhythm with the glowing waters. "Thomas, prepare to make sail." "Make sail," Thomas repeated incredulously. "You mean to follow that path?" "My father found something," James said, watching the underwater figures with grim fascination. "Something that cost him everything. I need to know what it was, and why it's calling to me now. After all these years." As if in response to his words, the blue glow flared brighter, and a face broke the surface, the same waterlogged visage of Edmund Blackwood that James had glimpsed earlier. This time, there was no mistaking the movement of its lips, forming words that carried across the water with unnatural clarity. "Come home, son. We've been waiting for you. Artifact, the Forbidden Tome, a leather-bound book written in blood, containing rituals for communicating with the dead and navigational charts that shift and change when not directly observed." "That wasn't your father," Thomas said firmly, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "Whatever's happening here, we need to approach it with clear heads." James nodded slowly, though the voice had struck something primal within him, a longing he'd buried decades ago. "Prepare the ship anyway," he ordered. "We may need to move quickly, whether toward that light or away from it." As the crew dispersed to their tasks, James returned to the captain's quarters, drawn by an impulse he couldn't name. The medallion and flute remained on the desk where he'd left them, but something had changed. The scattered papers had been arranged into a neat stack, and atop them sat a book James was certain hadn't been there before, bound in leather so dark it appeared almost black in the lantern light. The tome bore no title on its spine or cover. When James tentatively touched it, the leather felt warm and yielded slightly beneath his fingers, almost like living skin. Steeling himself, he opened the cover. The first page bore a single line in his father's handwriting, "For my son, when he is ready to understand." The pages that followed contained text in that same hand, but the ink, James touched it cautiously. The brownish-red substance flaked slightly under his finger. Blood. The entire book was written in blood. The contents proved equally disturbing. Rituals for speaking with the dead. Incantations to calm angry seas or summon tempests. Navigational charts to islands that appeared on no known map, islands that the text claimed existed, between the world of the living and the realm of the drowned. Most unsettling were the illustrations, detailed, drawings of sea creatures unlike any James had encountered in his decades of sailing. Not the familiar threats of sharks or barracuda, but humanoid figures with elongated limbs and two wide mouths filled with needle teeth. Somewhere between man and fish, but belonging truly to neither category, the deep ones, the text named them. Those who serve the ancient gods of the fathomless deep. James flipped through the pages more rapidly, disturbed yet unable to stop. The final section described a ritual his father had apparently performed, a ceremony intended to forge a pact with these deep ones in exchange for unfathomable treasure and eternal life beneath the waves. The price was steep, Edmund had written. But what is the worth of a mortal life compared to immortality? What value has a soul against power unending? I make this choice with eyes open, though my heart aches for what I leave behind. My only regret is you, my son. Perhaps someday you will understand and join us in our eternal kingdom. The final page contained a detailed map, not drawn in blood like the rest, but in some shimmering ink that seemed to move on the page. When James looked directly at certain islands, they appeared in one position, but when he glanced away and back, they had shifted slightly, as if the geography itself was unstable. One island was circled repeatedly, the marks gouged deep into the paper. Next to it, Edmund had written, "The Temple of the Deep, the Gateway, the beginning and the end." James closed the book with shaking hands. The implications were too terrible to contemplate. Had his father truly sacrificed himself and his crew in some mad quest for immortality? Had he somehow succeeded? A commotion on deck drew him from his dark musings. Tucking the book into his coat, he hurried topside to find the crew gathered at the starboard rail. "What is it?" he demanded. "Look, Captain!" Morris pointed toward the harbour. Rowing frantically toward the Redemption was a small boat containing a single figure, a woman in a dark cloak, her face obscured. "She came out of nowhere," Thomas explained. "Appeared at the end of the dock and demanded a boat. When no one would give her one, she took it by force." "By force? One woman?" Thomas nodded grimly. "3 men tried to stop her. They're still lying on the wharf." As the woman's boat drew nearer, James could make out more details. Her cloak was the deep green of seaweed, and what he had taken for a hood was in fact her hair, long, dark, and wet, plastered to her skull and hanging down to obscure her features. "Warn her off," James ordered. Suddenly certain they wanted no part of whoever or whatever was approaching, Thomas raised a speaking trumpet. "Halt and identify yourself." The woman paused in her rowing, lifting her face. Even from a distance, James could see that her skin had an unnatural pallor, almost luminescent in the moonlight. When she spoke, her voice carried across the water with the same unnatural clarity as the apparition of his father. "I am Isabella Blackwood," she called, the name striking James like a physical blow. "Wife of Edmund, mother of James, I have come to guide my son home. Artifact, the Locket of Memories." A silver heart-shaped locket containing a miniature portrait of James as a child, showing him with both parents, contradicting his belief that his mother died at his birth. "My mother died when I was born," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father told me so." Thomas glanced at his captain with concern. "Your orders, sir?" James stared at the approaching boat, transfixed by the impossible claim. Throughout his childhood, Edmund had spoken of James' mother only in the past tense, a beautiful woman taken by childbed fever, leaving Edmund to raise their son alone during his infrequent returns to land. Let her board, James decided, his need for answers overriding caution. "But stand ready." The woman who climbed the boarding ladder moved with unnatural grace despite her sodden clothes. Up close, her appearance was even more disturbing. Her skin had a translucent quality, blue veins visible beneath. Her eyes, when she finally brushed the wet hair from her face, were an impossible shade of green, the color of the deepest parts of the Caribbean. "My son," she said, her voice carrying the rhythmic quality of waves upon the shore. "How you've grown." "I am not your son," James replied firmly, though doubt had begun to creep into his certainty. "My mother died over 60 years ago." The woman's smile revealed teeth too sharp to be fully human. "Is that what Edmund told you? One of his many lies?" She moved closer, and James noted how the deck beneath her bare feet darkened with seawater, yet her steps left no sound. "He sent me away, James, banished me when he discovered what I truly was. What you, through me, partly are." A cold dread settled in James's stomach. "What are you?" Instead of answering, she reached into her cloak and withdrew a silver locket, heart-shaped and etched with intricate patterns of waves and shells. "You remember this, don't you? You were 5 when I gave it to you." James didn't remember, yet something about the locket tugged at the edges of his mind like a half-forgotten dream. When she opened it, revealing a miniature portrait inside, his breath caught. There he was, as a small child, standing between 2 adults, Edmund in his prime, and this woman, Isabella, looking exactly as she did now, unaged after nearly 7 decades. "Impossible," he whispered. "Take it," she urged, holding out the locket. "Remember." Against his better judgment, James accepted the trinket. The moment it touched his palm, images flooded his mind, memories long suppressed or deliberately forgotten. A cottage by the sea. His mother singing songs in a language that made the waves dance. His father's growing fear as he witnessed his wife's unnatural affinity with the ocean. Then the final memory. Edmund forcing Isabella into a rowboat at Sword Point, rowing her far from shore and abandoning her to the depths, returning to tell their son his mother had died of illness. "He tried to drown me," Isabella said, as if reading the memory alongside him. "But how do you drown a daughter of the sea?" James staggered back, the locket burning cold in his hand like the medallion had. "What are you?" he demanded again. "The folk of the land have many names for us," she replied. "Selkies, merfolk, the old ones, those who dwell in the deep places and remember when the stars were young." Her gaze sharpened. "Your father sought our power, made pacts with us, used me to gain favor with my kind, then feared what he had wrought when he realized the price." Thomas had moved protectively closer to James. "What price?" he asked when James remained silent, processing the impossible revelations. Isabella's unnerving smile returned. "The same price all mortals pay for touching divinity, transformation." She gestured toward the glowing path in the water. Edmund resisted at first, but in the end he embraced his new existence, as all do eventually. "The creatures beneath the water," James said, pieces falling into place. "My father, he's become one of them?" "He has ascended," Isabella corrected, "shed his mortal limitations. And now he sends me to bring you home, James, to claim your birthright." "My birthright?" "You are half of my blood," she explained. "The sea has always called to you, has it not? That pull you felt your entire life, drawing you to the horizon. It was no mere wanderlust, my son. It was your true nature calling." James couldn't deny the truth in her words. The sea had been his only constant companion, his true home. No port, no woman, no earthly treasure had ever held him for long when the tide turned. "The temple your father found," Isabella continued, "is a gateway between worlds. There those with the right bloodline can complete their transformation. Edmund has prepared everything for your arrival, and if I refuse—" Isabella's expression hardened, her features momentarily shifting to something inhuman before settling back into beauty. "The sea always claims what belongs to it, James. You can come willingly with honor, or you can resist and be taken anyway." She gestured toward the glowing water where more figures now circled. "Your father's crew made their choices. Some embraced the gift, others did not fare as well." "You speak of damnation," Thomas interjected. "Not gifts." Isabella regarded him coldly. "Human concerns, human limitations." She turned back to James. "You have until dawn to decide. Follow the path to the temple willingly, or we shall come for you." With that, she stepped backward over the rail, dropping into the water with barely a splash. When James rushed to look overboard, there was no sign of her, only the glowing trail stretching out to sea, pulsing like a heartbeat. "Orders, Captain?" Thomas asked quietly. James closed his fist around the locket, feeling its cold weight. "Prepare to sail," he said. "We have decisions to make before dawn." Artifact, the silver trident, a miniature weapon found in the ship's hidden compartment, growing to full size when immersed in seawater, capable of controlling ocean currents and calling forth storms. "We sail at first light," James announced to the gathered crew. They stood in the captain's quarters, faces grim in the lantern light, toward the light path. Thomas questioned, concern evident in his voice. James nodded. "Whatever awaits us there, we face it head-on. My father made choices that have rippled through time to find me. I need answers, and they lie at that temple." He looked around at the small group of loyal men. "Any who wish to remain behind may do so without shame. This is not your burden." None moved, though fear was plain on their faces. "Thank you," James said, genuinely moved. "Get what rest you can. Dawn comes soon enough." When the others had departed, James turned his attention back to the artifacts gathered on the desk. The journal, the bone flute, the compass, the medallion, the forbidden tome, and the locket. Items of power, each connected to the mystery. Pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. "Something's missing," he murmured to himself, scanning the room. His father had been methodical, almost obsessive. If he'd left these items for James to find, there would be something more, something to tie them all together. On instinct, James began searching the cabin, tapping walls and floorboards, looking for hidden compartments. Behind the portrait with the slashed face, he found what he sought, a small panel that slid aside to reveal a narrow space. Within lay a silver trident no longer than his hand, intricately detailed, with oceanic motifs and glyphs matching those in the tome. When he lifted it, the trident felt unusually heavy for its size, as if it contained more substance than its dimensions suggested. Unlike the coldness of the medallion, the trident radiated a subtle warmth, and James could swear he felt vibrations pulsing through it, like a heartbeat, or the rhythm of waves. The compass needle swung immediately to point at the miniature weapon. More tellingly, the lock of hair in his pendant began to glow brighter, coiling with renewed animation. Following an impulse he didn't fully understand, James moved to the small wash basin in the corner of the cabin. He filled it with water from the pitcher and submerged the silver trident. The effect was immediate and astonishing. The water bubbled and churned as if suddenly brought to boil, and the trident began to grow, forcing James to step back as it expanded beyond the basin's confines. In moments, it had transformed from a trinket to a full-sized weapon, nearly 7 feet of gleaming silver. The 3 prongs at its head wickedly sharp and humming with power, as if responding to the trident's presence. The ship groaned around him, timbers shifting. Through the cabin's windows, James could see the glowing path in the water pulse brighter. A knock at the door broke his fascination. "Enter!" he called. Unable to tear his eyes from the transformed weapon, Thomas stepped in, stopping short at the sight. "Captain, what in God's name?" "Another piece of the puzzle," James replied. "A weapon of power, I believe." Thomas approached cautiously. "The men are restless. The water grows stranger by the hour, shapes moving beneath the surface, lights appearing and disappearing. They're watching us," James said with certainty, "waiting for our decision." "And what is our decision, truly?" Thomas asked, his voice low. "Do we sail to this temple to stop whatever your father began, or—" He hesitated. "Or do I sail to join him?" James finished. "Is that your fear?" Thomas met his captain's gaze directly. "The woman spoke of your bloodline, of transformation. These artifacts, these phenomena, they're changing you already." "I can see it." James hadn't wanted to acknowledge it, but Thomas was right. Since boarding the Redemption, he'd felt alterations within himself. His senses had sharpened. He could smell the salt and brine of the sea with newfound intensity, could hear the whispers of the waves against the hull like conversations just below comprehension. Most disturbing, the call of the depths had grown stronger, a siren song promising belonging and power. "I will not surrender to it," James said firmly, gripping the trident. "Whatever my father intended, whatever my mother desires, I remain my own master." As if in response to his defiance, the trident pulsed with energy, and outside, a sudden squall whipped the previously calm harbor into whitecaps. Thomas stared from the window to the trident and back. "Did you?" James looked down at the weapon in shock. "I think I did." Moving to the window, he focused his attention on a particular section of water and willed it to calm. To his amazement, the waves there subsided into a perfect circle of stillness amid the churning. "Captain," Thomas whispered. "You can control the sea, not the sea," James corrected, a new understanding dawning. "Just small portions of it. For now." He set the trident carefully against the wall, and immediately the squall began to subside. "My mother said I was half of her blood. Perhaps this is part of that heritage. All the more reason to proceed with caution," Thomas urged. "If these abilities are awakening in you, who knows what awaits at this temple?" James nodded grimly. "All the more reason to be prepared." He gestured to the artifacts. "Gather these carefully. We'll need every advantage when dawn comes." As Thomas began collecting the items, James turned back to the window, gazing out at the now calm harbor where the glowing path still pulsed, calling him to destinations unknown. In the reflection of the glass, he caught a glimpse of his own eyes and froze. For just a moment, they had glowed with the same unearthly green as his mother's. Artifact, the coral crown. A circlet made of blood-red coral that whispers secrets of the deep to its wearer and grants visions of the underwater kingdom awaiting James. Dawn arrived with unnatural swiftness, as if the night itself had been abbreviated by forces beyond mortal understanding. The glowing path in the water had intensified. Now a brilliant azure ribbon cutting through the grey morning sea. James stood at the helm of the Redemption, feeling the ship respond to his touch with unusual sensitivity. The vessel seemed eager to follow the luminous trail, straining against its moorings like a hound catching a scent. "Cut the anchor," he ordered. "Set full sail." As his small crew rushed to comply, James felt the weight of the silver trident at his side. He'd fashioned a makeshift harness to carry the weapon, unwilling to let it out of his reach after discovering its power. The other artifacts were secured in a sea chest in the captain's quarters, save for the compass and pendant, which he kept on his person. "Are you certain of this course, Captain?" Thomas asked quietly, joining him at the wheel. "I'm certain of nothing," James admitted. "But we cannot remain here. The harbour folk grow suspicious, and my mother's people grow impatient." He gestured toward the water, where shadowy figures continued to circle the ship. "Better to meet our fate on our terms than to wait for it to claim us." With the anchor raised and sails unfurled, the Redemption caught the morning breeze and began to move. As the bow aligned with the glowing path, James felt a surge of energy course through him, not unlike the sensation of the trident's power. But deeper, more primal. "Captain," called Daniels from the bow. "Something's rising from the water." James rushed forward to see a dark shape ascending from the depths directly in their path. The crew tensed, hands moving to weapons, but James raised a hand for restraint. As the object breached the surface, he recognized it. A crown or circlet fashioned from coral of the deepest red, like blood solidified into delicate branches. Without thinking, James reached out with the trident. The crown rose from the water as if pulled by invisible hands, hovering momentarily before floating to rest upon the trident's prongs. The water dripped from the coral formation, each droplet sizzling with tiny blue sparks as it hit the deck. "What is it?" Thomas whispered, staring at the crown with undisguised fear. "A gift," James replied, though he couldn't have explained how he knew. "Or a test." Taking the crown from the trident, he was surprised by its lightness. It seemed to weigh nothing at all, as if it existed partially in some other realm. The coral felt warm against his skin, pulsing faintly like a living thing. "Captain," Thomas warned, "I wouldn't," but James had already raised the crown to his head. The moment it touched his brow, the world around him vanished. He found himself standing in an impossible place, a vast underwater city of coral towers and pearl-encrusted domes. Strange light filtered from above, casting everything in shades of blue and green. Around him moved figures both human and not, some with the upper bodies of men and women, but lower halves that transformed into tentacles or fishtails. Others completely humanoid, but with gills at their necks and webbing between their fingers. In the center of this metropolis stood a massive temple, its architecture like nothing on earth, curves and angles that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality. Constructed from some black stone that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Atop its highest spire, a beacon pulsed with the same blue luminescence as the path they followed. Within this vision, James felt himself moving forward, drawn toward the temple. As he approached, a figure emerged from its entrance. His father, Edmund Blackwood, but transformed. No longer fully human, Edmund's skin shimmered with scales in places. His eyes the same impossible green as Isabella's, yet his face retained enough humanity for James to recognize the father he'd known in youth. "Welcome home." "My son," Edmund's voice echoed in James's mind rather than his ears. "We've waited so long. What is this place?" James asked, his own voice strange and distant. "Nyarlathos," Edmund replied, "the ancient city of those who dwell beneath. Our kingdom now and soon yours." "I don't understand," James protested. "What happened to you?" "To your crew." Edmund smiled, revealing teeth that had grown sharp. "Transcendence happened, James. Evolution. We shed our mortal limitations and embraced our true potential." He gestured around at the fantastic cityscape. "Humans have always looked to the heavens for divinity, never realizing that true godhood awaits in the depths." Before James could respond, the vision shifted. He saw himself seated upon a throne of coral and pearl, the transformed creatures of the deep bowing before him. In this image, his own transformation was complete, his lower body a powerful tail, his skin gleaming with iridescent scales, the trident in one webbed hand and the coral crown upon his brow. "This is your destiny," Edmund's voice continued. "The culmination of bloodlines centuries in the making. Your mother's people have waited generations for one like you, half of the land, half of the sea, capable of wielding powers from both realms." As suddenly as it had come, the vision vanished. James found himself back on the deck of the Redemption, the coral crown still upon his head, his crew staring at him in alarm. "Captain?" Thomas's voice seemed to come from a great distance. "You've been standing motionless for nearly 10 minutes. Your eyes—" He trailed off, unable to describe what he'd seen. James removed the crown, his hands shaking slightly. "I saw it," he said. "The place where the path leads. A city beneath the waves. My father awaits us there. Is he alive then?" Daniels asked. "Not as we understand life," James replied grimly. "He's become something else. Something he wants me to become as well." The Redemption surged forward suddenly, as if pulled by unseen forces. The glowing path beneath them pulsed with renewed intensity. "We're committed now," James said, tucking the coral crown carefully into his coat. "We follow this path to its end, and then?" Thomas asked. James gripped the rail, watching the normal sea give way to waters unnaturally still and blue. "Then we decide whether to embrace the depths or fight our way back to the world of the living." Artifact, the Shell of Voices. A large conch shell that captures and replays conversations from the past, revealing Edmund's growing madness and the mutiny his crew attempted before their transformation. The Redemption sailed with unnatural speed along the glowing path. No wind filled her sails, yet they remained taut, as if the ship were pulled forward by some invisible force. The ordinary blue of the Caribbean had given way to waters of a deeper, more luminous hue, waters that bore no resemblance to any sea James had encountered in his long career. Most disturbing was the silence. No seabirds circled overhead, no fish leaped from the depths. Even the normal creaking of the ship's timbers had ceased, as if the vessel held its breath in anticipation. 3 hours on this course, Thomas reported, joining James at the bow. "The men are uneasy. Nothing but this strange water as far as the eye can see." James nodded, understanding their concern. The endless expanse of glowing blue, without landmark or reference point, was disorienting, almost hypnotic. He'd ordered regular depth soundings, but each attempt yielded the same impossible result. The weighted line descended hundreds of fathoms without finding bottom. "We're no longer in familiar waters," James said quietly. "Perhaps no longer in the world as we know it. The men whisper of the Bermuda Triangle, of ships that sail into mists never to return." James smiled grimly. If only it were something so mundane. He touched the coral crown in his coat, feeling its warmth pulse in rhythm with the pendant at his neck. "We sail towards something far stranger than any sailor's superstition." A sudden shout from the crow's nest interrupted their conversation. "Object off the starboard bow!" James raised his spyglass, focusing on a dark shape floating in the water ahead. As they drew nearer, he could make out a massive conch shell, larger than any he'd ever seen, easily the size of a rowboat, its spiral form gleaming with pearlescent hues. "Bring us alongside," James ordered. "Prepare to retrieve it." The men managed to haul the enormous shell aboard with some difficulty. Its surface was warm to the touch and intricately patterned with the same strange symbols found on the other artifacts. When placed on the deck, it balanced perfectly on its point, though by all rights it should have toppled. "What do you make of it, Captain?" Daniels asked, circling the shell with unconcealed wonder. Before James could answer, the shell emitted a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the deck. Then impossibly, voices began to issue from its opening, distant at first, then growing clearer. "Madness, Captain!" A man's frightened voice echoed. "We've been sailing in circles for weeks." "Patience, Mr. Rhodes," James started at the sound of his father's voice, exactly as he remembered it. "We're precisely where we need to be." "The men are talking of mutiny," another voice warned. "They say you've doomed us all for some treasure that doesn't exist." Edmund's laugh held an edge of mania. "Treasure? Is that what they think we seek? Mere gold and jewels?" A pause, then more quietly. "I've seen it, Quartermaster. In my dreams. The city beneath the waves. The power it offers. Immortality. Godhood." "You sound like a madman, sir." The Quartermaster's voice was respectful but firm. "The men follow Captain Edmund Blackwood, terror of the Spanish Main, not some mystic chasing visions." "They'll understand when we arrive," Edmund insisted. "The island will appear at the dark of the moon. The temple awaits. My wife's people have promised." "Your wife is dead, Captain. These creatures you've been communing with, they're demons, sir. They've poisoned your mind." The shell fell silent momentarily. Then new voices emerged, a chaotic jumble of shouts and screams. "Take him!" "Bind the captain!" "Mutiny!" "To arms, loyal men!" The clash of steel, cries of pain. Then Edmund's voice again, strained with rage. "You fools! You've damned us all." A woman's voice joined the cacophony. Isabella, her tone coldly triumphant. "Too late. The ritual has begun. The offering is made." Screams followed, the kind of screams that could only come from men experiencing agony beyond comprehension. Through it all, Edmund's laughter growing more inhuman by the second. "Yes, I feel it. The transformation begins." The final sound from the shell was the most disturbing, a wet, tearing noise, as of flesh being ripped and remolded, accompanied by a chorus of bubbling moans that were neither fully human nor entirely animal. Then silence fell once more. The crew of the Redemption stood frozen, faces pale with horror. Thomas was the first to recover his voice. "They attempted mutiny," he said quietly. "And in response, your father sacrificed them somehow." James nodded grimly. "To the deep ones, the creatures my mother spoke of." He touched the shell cautiously. "This was no simple transformation. It was a conversion forced upon unwilling men. Will the same fate await us at this temple?" Daniels asked, voicing the fear evident on every face. "No," James said firmly, gripping the trident at his side. "I won't allow it. Whatever my father has become, whatever he offers, I'll not sacrifice my men or myself to these depths." Even as he spoke, James felt the ship lurch beneath them, its speed increasing. Ahead, a dark smudge had appeared on the horizon, land rising impossibly from seas too deep to harbor islands. "Make ready," he ordered. "We'll reach our destination by nightfall." Thomas lowered his voice so only James could hear. "And if your father's people attempt to take the ship by force?" James' hand tightened on the trident, and he felt power surge through it in response to his will. "Then they'll learn that the blood of the sea runs both ways. I may be half of my mother's kind, but I've spent a lifetime as a man. I'll not surrender that humanity without a fight." The dark shape on the horizon grew larger, its silhouette resolving into a jagged mountain peak shrouded in mist. The Temple of the Deep, precisely as James had seen it in the vision granted by the Coral Crown. Their destination approached. The final confrontation awaited. Artifact. The Black Pearl. A perfect sphere of impossible darkness that absorbs all light, containing a drop of blood from each transformed crew member, binding them eternally to Edmund's will. As dusk descended, the Redemption approached the mysterious island. No natural formation, this landmass rose from the depths like a spear thrust through the ocean floor, a single mountain of black stone, its peak lost in swirling clouds that glowed with the same eerie blue as the path they'd followed. At the island's base, a natural harbor curved inward, as if the land itself opened arms in welcome, or in hunger. "Prepare to drop anchor," James ordered, studying the shoreline through his spyglass. No beaches softened the island's meeting with the sea. The black stone plunged directly into the water, forming sheer cliffs on all sides save for the harbor entrance. "There," he murmured, focusing on a structure carved into the cliff face. A dock, and beyond it stairs leading upward. Thomas took the glass, confirming James's observation. "Convenient," he said dryly. "Almost as if they're expecting us." "They are," James replied. "They have been for decades." As the Redemption glided into the harbor, the water around them came alive with movement. Dozens of figures surfaced, forming an honor guard of sorts. The transformed crew of Edmund Blackwood's original voyage. Their bodies were grotesque parodies of their human forms. Skin mottled with scales and fins, limbs elongated and webbed, faces distorted with gills and two wide mouths filled with needle teeth. Yet within these monstrosities, James could still discern the men they had once been, sailors not unlike his own crew, who had sailed in search of adventure and fortune, only to find damnation in the depths. "Keep your weapons ready," James instructed his men, "but hold fire unless attacked." "We're outnumbered 100 to 1. The ship eased alongside the ancient dock, its timbers groaning as if in protest at touching this unnatural shore. As the gangplank was lowered, a lone figure separated from the others in the water, climbing onto the dock with sinuous grace. Isabella, her transformation more complete than in their previous encounter. Her lower body was now entirely serpentine, a powerful tail that propelled her forward with unsettling speed. Her face remained beautiful, but had taken on aspects of the predator, cheekbones too sharp, eyes too large, teeth visibly pointed even when her mouth was closed. "My son returns to the fold," she called, her voice carrying that same unnatural resonance. "Your father awaits at the temple. He sends a gift to ease your passage." From within the folds of what appeared to be a garment made from some shimmering membrane, she withdrew a perfect sphere of the deepest black, a pearl the size of a man's fist. Yet it seemed to absorb rather than reflect the fading light. "The heart of the deep," Isabella named it. "The binding force that unites all who have taken the oath and undergone the change." "I've taken no oath," James replied coldly. "Nor do I intend to." Isabella's smile revealed rows of teeth where a human would have only one. "Intention matters little, James. Blood calls to blood. The sea claims its own." She held the black pearl higher. "This contains a drop of blood from each who has transformed, including your father's. Once you add yours, the circle will be complete." James felt the trident grow warm against his side, responding to his mounting anger. "And if I refuse this gift, then you condemn yourself and your men to death," she replied simply. "The old ways demand either transformation or sacrifice. There is no third path." With that ultimatum hanging in the air, she placed the black pearl on the dock and retreated into the water, joining the circle of transformed creatures surrounding the ship. "What now, Captain?" Thomas asked quietly. James studied the black pearl, feeling its pull even from a distance. All the artifacts had called to him, awakening something dormant in his blood. But this one radiated power beyond the others. A dark, seductive force promising answers to questions he'd carried his entire life. "We proceed as planned," he decided. "I'll take the pearl. We may need its power, but I'll not surrender to it." Using the cloth still wrapped around the golden medallion, James carefully lifted the black pearl without allowing it to touch his skin directly. Even through the barrier he could feel its cold power pulsing, hungry for his blood. "Thomas, Daniels, Morris, you'll accompany me to the temple. The rest remain with the ship, prepared to depart at a moment's notice should things go awry." "And what of them?" Morris gestured toward the watching creatures in the water. "They'll not attack unless ordered," James replied with certainty, though he couldn't have explained how he knew. "At least, not until we reach the temple and make our choice." With the black pearl secured in his coat alongside the other artifacts, James led his small party down the gangplank onto the ancient dock. The wood beneath their feet felt strange, not rotted, despite its apparent age and constant exposure to seawater, but somehow alive, flexing subtly with each step. "The whole island feels wrong," Thomas murmured, glancing nervously at the transformed crew members watching from the water. "Like we've stepped into another world entirely." "Perhaps we have," James replied, gazing up at the stone stairs that wound their way up the mountainside. At the summit, barely visible through the swirling mists. A structure of impossible geometry loomed, the Temple of the Deep, precisely as he had seen it in the vision granted by the coral crown. "My father awaits," he said grimly, "and with him answers I've sought my entire life." He turned to his men, meeting each pair of eyes. "Whatever happens, know that you've served with honor. If there's a way to end this curse without bloodshed, I'll find it." With the trident gripped firmly in one hand, James began the ascent, each step taking him closer to confrontation with the father he'd spent a lifetime trying not to become. Artifact. The altar stone, an obsidian slab at the temple's center, carved with the history of the Deep Ones, which bleeds salt water when touched by one of their bloodline. The climb seemed to defy natural law. Though the stairs appeared to extend for thousands of feet up the mountainside, James and his 3 companions reached the summit in less than an hour, with barely any fatigue. More disconcerting still was the way the island itself appeared to shift around them, sections of cliff face and vegetation rearranging when viewed from different angles, as if the entire landmass existed partially in some other dimension. "It's like the island wants us to reach the top," Morris observed nervously. "It does," James replied, the weight of the artifacts heavy in his coat. "We're expected." The temple loomed before them, its architecture an abomination of angles and curves that hurt the eye to follow. Built of the same black stone as the mountain, it seemed less constructed than grown, as if it had erupted organically from the peak itself. No windows pierced its surface, only a single massive doorway, shaped like the gaping maw of some deep-sea predator. "Stay close," James instructed, gripping the trident tightly as they approached the entrance. "Touch nothing unless I say otherwise." The interior was illuminated by a sickly blue glow that emanated from pools of liquid scattered throughout the vast chamber. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet overhead, supported by columns carved to resemble tentacled beings in various poses of worship or agony. It was impossible to tell which. At the center of the chamber stood a massive altar of polished obsidian, its surface etched with the same symbols found on the artifacts. The altar was perfectly rectangular, large enough to accommodate a human body, laid flat and raised about waist-high from the floor. Unlike everything else in the temple, it appeared perfectly normal in its proportions, almost deliberately ordinary amid the surrounding chaos of design. "Welcome, my son," a voice echoed from the shadows beyond the altar. "At last you have returned to claim your birthright." Edmund Blackwood emerged into the blue light, his transformation even more complete than Isabella's had been. Little remained of the human James had known in youth. His father's body was now a chimeric blend of man and sea creature, with scaled skin, webbed hands ending in sharp claws, and a face that retained just enough of its former features for James to recognize. Yet the eyes remained the same, that piercing gaze that had always seemed to look through James rather than at him, judging and finding him wanting. "Father," James acknowledged coldly. "Or what remains of him." Edmund smiled, revealing rows of needle teeth. "More than remains, James, I have transcended. Become something greater than human limitations would allow." He gestured around the temple. "All this can be yours as well. The power of the depths, the secrets of the ancient ones who ruled this world when mankind's ancestors still swung from trees." "At what cost?" James demanded. "Your humanity, your soul. The lives of your crew, transformed against their will." Edmund waved a webbed hand dismissively. "Necessary sacrifices. The weak cannot inherit the new world that comes." His gaze sharpened. "You've brought the artifacts. Good. Place them upon the altar and we can begin the ritual." James made no move to comply. "First, answers. What is this place? What are these Deep Ones you've allied yourself with? What do they truly want?" A low, gurgling sound emerged from Edmund's throat, a laugh filtered through gills. "So many questions, when all the answers lie within your blood." He moved closer, circling the altar. "But very well. The Deep Ones are the original inheritors of this world, beings of power who retreated beneath the waves when the stars changed eons ago. They have waited, watched, selected carefully, those humans worthy of joining their ranks. Worthy? Thomas interjected, unable to contain himself. You forced your crew into this monstrosity. Edmund's eyes flashed with anger. Silence, human! You speak of matters beyond your comprehension. He turned back to James. Your mother was one of them, a princess of the deep, sent to find a worthy mate. I was chosen, James, and through me you were created, a perfect fusion of land and sea, capable of channeling powers beyond mortal understanding. So I'm what then? James asked bitterly. Some kind of bridge between worlds? A tool for invasion? A king, Edmund corrected. The first of a new race that will reclaim this world from the surface dwellers who have despoiled it. He gestured to the altar. Place your hand upon the stone. It will recognize your bloodline, and the final transformation can begin. James approached the altar cautiously, keeping the trident between himself and his father. The obsidian surface appeared to ripple slightly as he drew near, as if it were liquid rather than solid. And if I refuse? He asked, already knowing the answer. Then you and your men die here, Edmund replied matter-of-factly, and I continue waiting for another of our bloodline to eventually find their way to these shores. The Deep Ones are patient, James. They have waited millennia. They can wait centuries more if needed. James looked back at his loyal men, then to the father who had become a monster, and finally down at the obsidian altar. With deliberate slowness, he set the trident against the stone and placed his palm flat upon the etched surface. The effect was immediate and shocking. The stone beneath his hand liquefied, becoming a pool of what appeared to be seawater that bubbled up around his fingers. More disturbing still, James could feel the liquid being drawn into his skin, absorbed as if his flesh were a sponge. At the same moment, the symbols etched into the stone began to glow with the same blue light as the path that had led them here. The illumination spread, racing along channels in the floor that James hadn't noticed before, until the entire temple was suffused with pulsing radiance. Yes, Edmund hissed, his voice thick with triumph. The altar recognizes our bloodline. The covenant is affirmed. He moved closer, his transformed body seeming to flow rather than walk. Now the artifacts. Place them all upon the altar, and your ascension can begin. Artifact, the crystal vial, a container holding the essence of the Deep Ones, which when shattered releases their true form, a cosmic horror beyond human comprehension. James withdrew his hand from the altar, watching as the liquid seawater that had emerged from the stone was now completely absorbed into his skin. A tingling sensation spread up his arm, and for a brief, terrifying moment he saw the flesh ripple, scales beginning to form beneath the surface before fading back to normal. The change has already begun, Edmund observed with satisfaction. Your mother's blood awakens within you. Now the artifacts. Fighting against the strange sensations coursing through his body, James reached into his coat and withdrew the items one by one. The brass key, the journal, the bone flute, the medallion, the forbidden tome, the locket, the coral crown. And finally, wrapped carefully in cloth, the black pearl. Only the silver trident remained in his hand, its weight comforting, its power still responding to his will despite the changes beginning within him. As each artifact was placed upon the altar, it began to glow with the same blue luminescence, seeming to meld partially with the obsidian surface. When James set down the black pearl, a ripple of energy pulsed through the room, causing the pools of liquid scattered throughout the chamber to surge upward in geysers that nearly reached the distant ceiling. Excellent, Edmund hissed, his transformed features alight with fervor. Now the final piece. He reached into his robes and withdrew a crystal vial, roughly the size of a man's thumb, filled with a swirling substance that appeared neither liquid nor gas, but something in between, constantly shifting in hue between deep green and midnight blue. The essence of the Deep Ones, Edmund explained, holding the vial reverently, collected over eons from the oldest and most powerful of their kind. One drop of this added to your blood, combined with the power of the artifacts, will complete your transformation. And what exactly will I become? James demanded, still gripping the trident tightly. Behind him he could sense Thomas and the others tensing, hands on weapons, awaiting his signal. Something glorious, Edmund replied, his voice taking on an almost religious cadence. Neither fully human nor fully of the deep, but a perfect fusion, a being capable of existing in both worlds and commanding the powers of each. His eyes gleamed with a fanatical light. You will be the first of a new ruling class, James, a god among mortals. And my men? James nodded toward his loyal crew. What of them? Edmund's gaze flickered dismissively over the three sailors. Lesser transformations can be granted to those you deem worthy of serving you. The rest will feed the depths, their life force strengthening the ancient ones. I see. James's voice was deadly calm. So I'm to become a monster like you, ruling over slaves, murdering those who refuse to submit? You speak of human concepts? Edmund scoffed. Morality, ethics, constructs created by weak beings to protect themselves from the strong. Once you transcend, you'll understand the pettiness of such concerns. And if I refuse? James asked, already knowing the answer. Edmund's expression hardened. Then you die here, your potential wasted. He gestured, and from the shadowed recesses of the temple emerged dozens of transformed beings, the crew of the original Redemption, now completely subservient to their captain's will. My patience has limits, son. The creatures moved with unnatural speed, surrounding James and his men in moments. Thomas and the others drew their weapons, but James knew they stood no chance against such numbers. Wait, he said, raising his hand. I wish to examine this essence. Before I decide. Edmund hesitated, then nodded, extending the crystal vial. Behold the power that shall transform you. James took the vial carefully, holding it up to the blue light. Within the crystal confines, the substance seemed alive, swirling and pulsing, as if aware it was being observed. And perhaps it was. James could sense intelligence within it, ancient and utterly alien, regarding him with cold curiosity. This contains the actual essence of these beings? He asked, turning the vial to examine it from all angles. Their life force. Their godhood, Edmund corrected. Distilled over millennia, waiting for one worthy to receive it. His voice lowered to a reverential whisper. The deep ones existed before humanity crawled from the oceans, James. They will exist long after the stars burn out. Through this, you join their immortality. In that moment, James understood with perfect clarity what he must do. The trident in his hand vibrated with power, responding to his decision even before he consciously made it. You know, he said conversationally, my entire life I defined myself in opposition to you, the honorable merchant captain versus the butcher of Barbados. He looked Edmund directly in his inhuman eyes. But perhaps we're more alike than I wanted to admit. We both make difficult choices when necessary. With that, James raised the crystal vial high, then brought it down hard upon the obsidian altar. The crystal shattered with a sound like 1,000 screaming voices. The substance within exploded outward, not splashing like liquid, but expanding like living smoke, coiling and writhing in patterns that hurt the human mind to observe. No! Edmund's roar of rage echoed throughout the temple. Do you realize what you've done? Freed it, James replied grimly, backing away from the altar as the essence continued to expand, taking on forms that defied comprehension, geometries that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, appendages that seemed to reach through reality itself. You've doomed us all, Edmund snarled, his body contorting with fury. The essence cannot be contained once released. It will consume everything it touches, including you and your deep ones, James observed calmly, raising the trident as the swirling horror began to take more substantial form above the altar. Some prices are worth paying to end a curse. Artifact, the heart of the deep, a pulsing organic crystal, revealed when the altar splits open. The true power source behind the Deep One's immortality and abilities, chaos, erupted in the temple. The released essence swirled upward, forming impossible shapes that twisted and writhed, growing larger by the second. Where it touched the transformed crew members, their bodies began to dissolve, flesh melting away as they screamed in agony. "Fall back!" James commanded his men, positioning himself between them and the horror unfolding at the altar. "Get to the entrance." Thomas and the others didn't need to be told twice. They retreated toward the temple doorway, weapons drawn, though they all knew conventional arms would be useless against what they faced. Edmund Blackwood staggered backward from the expanding essence, his transformed body seemingly more resistant to its touch than his crew, though pustules began to form where droplets had landed on his scaled skin. "You fool," he snarled at James. "You've released their true form before the temple is prepared to contain it. It will consume everything, the island, the sea, eventually the world." The obsidian altar began to crack, fissures spreading across its surface as the artifact sank deeper into the stone. With a deafening sound like breaking ice, the altar split open, revealing a hidden chamber beneath. Within pulsed a massive crystalline structure, organic in appearance, like a giant heart composed of the same swirling substance that had been in the vial, but solid somehow, with veins of blue luminescence running through it. "The heart of the deep," Edmund whispered, momentary awe replacing his fury. "The source of their power, their true form in our reality." James had backed away but not fled entirely. The trident in his hands hummed with energy, growing warmer as if responding to the presence of the heart. Instinctively, he raised the weapon, pointing it toward the pulsing crystal. "No." Edmund lunged forward, but it was too late. A bolt of energy, not lightning, but something more primal, like concentrated seawater charged with power, leapt from the trident's tines to strike the heart. The crystal shuddered, cracks appearing across its surface. The swirling essence that had been expanding throughout the chamber suddenly reversed direction, drawn back toward the damaged heart as if pulled by an irresistible force. "You've wounded it." Edmund's voice held disbelief. "The trident. It's a weapon forged to control them, not serve them." He stared at James with new understanding. "Your mother gave you that, didn't she? Not to aid your transformation, but to give you a choice." The temple shook violently as the heart pulsed more erratically. Chunks of stone began falling from the distant ceiling. The pools of liquid throughout the chamber boiled and steamed. "We need to leave now," Thomas shouted from the entrance. "The whole place is coming down." James backed toward his men, keeping the trident trained on the heart and the now frenzied essence swirling around it. Edmund remained near the altar, caught between retreat and the desire to somehow salvage his plans. "Come with us, Father," James called, surprising himself with the offer. "It's not too late. Whatever they did to you, perhaps it can be undone." For a moment, something human flickered in Edmund's transformed features. Regret, perhaps, or longing for what had been lost. Then his expression hardened once more. "There is no undoing what has been done, James. I am of the deep now, bound to their fate." He stretched out a webbed hand toward the heart, "as are you, whether you accept it or not. Your blood has been awakened. You may run, but the sea will always call you home." As if in response to his words, the heart pulsed once more, sending out a shockwave of energy that knocked everyone off their feet. James felt something tear within him, not physical but deeper, as if a part of his very being was being ripped away. Blood began to trickle from his nose and ears. "Captain!" Morris helped him to his feet. "We must go." Half dragged by his men, James staggered toward the exit as more of the temple collapsed around them. Looking back, he saw Edmund standing before the damaged heart, arms outstretched as the swirling essence engulfed him completely. For an instant, James glimpsed something within that chaotic mass, a form both his father and something else, transforming yet again into something beyond human comprehension. Then the ceiling gave way entirely, massive blocks of stone crashing down to bury the altar, the heart, and Edmund Blackwood beneath tons of rubble. The four men raced down the mountain path as the entire peak began to crumble. All around the island, the sea churned and boiled, massive waves crashing against the cliffs. The blue glow that had illuminated the waters faded, replaced by a sickly greenish hue that spread outward like a stain. The ship! Thomas pointed toward the harbor, where the Redemption waited, its crew visibly panicking on the deck as the transformed beings in the water thrashed in apparent agony. "I'm dissolving into foam like the crew members in the temple. They're dying," James realized. "Whatever I did to the heart, it's affecting all of them." "Good riddance," Morris muttered, but James couldn't share the sentiment entirely. These had been men once, sailors like themselves, corrupted by forces beyond their understanding or control. As they reached the dock, James paused, looking back at the crumbling mountain. The temple had completely collapsed, but something still moved within the ruins, something vast and shapeless, neither fully material nor entirely ethereal. "What is that?" Daniels whispered. "The true form of the Deep Ones," James replied grimly. Freed from the heart that bound and controlled them, he gripped the trident tighter, feeling its power surge in response to his will. And their angry artifact, the sea glass shard, a fragment of crystallized ocean that allows James to temporarily control the essence of the Deep Ones, buying time for escape while sacrificing part of himself. "Get to the ship," James ordered, shoving his men toward the gangplank as the amorphous horror continued to rise from the temple ruins. "Prepare to make sail immediately." The remaining crew on the Redemption worked feverishly to ready the vessel, horror evident on their faces as they witnessed the island's destruction and the death throes of the transformed creatures in the water. The latter no longer resembled anything human, their bodies dissolving into primordial soup that fed the growing abomination on the mountaintop. As Thomas and the others raced aboard, James remained on the dock, transfixed by what was emerging. The formless mass had begun to coalesce into something with more definite shape, a towering monstrosity that combined aspects of cephalopod, crustacean, and other deep-sea creatures, yet remained fundamentally alien. Multiple eyes of varying sizes opened across its surface, all fixing on the harbor below. On James, it knows me, he realized with bone-deep certainty. It recognizes its own. The sea around the dock began to churn and rise, forming tendrils of water that reached toward the Redemption. One crashed down on the deck, narrowly missing Morris as he worked to raise the anchor. "Captain!" Thomas called desperately from the rail. "We must leave now." James knew his first mate was right, yet something held him in place, not just the hypnotic horror of the creature above, but a strange, pulling sensation within his blood. The awakening his mother had spoken of. The connection to the Deep Ones that his father had tried to fully activate. A movement caught his eye, something glinting at the edge of the dock where the increasingly violent waves crashed against the stone. A shard of what appeared to be sea glass, but unlike any James had ever seen. It glowed with the same blue luminescence as the path that had led them here, but contained within it swirled tiny motes of the same essence he had released in the temple. Instinctively, James knelt and grabbed the shard. Pain shot through his palm as the glass cut deep, but instead of blood welling from the wound, a mixture of crimson and luminescent blue emerged. The shard seemed to drink it in, glowing brighter as it absorbed what flowed from him. The effect was immediate and astonishing. The water tendrils attacking the ship froze in place, then collapsed back into the harbor. The massive creature on the mountain paused in its formation, its many eyes blinking in apparent confusion. James felt power flow through him, not the corrupting transformation his father had embraced, but something different, a connection, a channel between worlds. Through the shard, he could sense the Deep One's presence, their fury at being released from their containment, their hunger to consume this world as they had others before, and he could direct them. "If only briefly. Go back," he whispered, focusing his will through the shard and the trident, which hummed in harmony with the glass. "Return to the depths." The creature shuddered, its form rippling with conflicting impulses. James felt resistance, ancient minds pushing against his command, seeking weaknesses in his resolve. Images flooded his consciousness, cities beneath the waves, worlds beyond human comprehension, power and knowledge that spanned eons. But also hunger, endless, insatiable hunger that had consumed countless worlds before Earth. James saw through the creatures' memories, the civilizations they had infiltrated, corrupted, and ultimately devoured. Earth was meant to be next, with his father and the transformed crew as their bridgehead. Never, James roared, channeling every ounce of his will through the connection. Back to the depths! The shard in his hand flared with blinding intensity. The creature on the mountain recoiled, its form losing cohesion, beginning to flow back toward the sea, but away from the harbor where the redemption waited. James staggered, feeling something vital draining from him. With each moment he maintained the connection. The shard was taking its price, not just blood, but something more fundamental. I can't hold it long, he gasped, as Thomas raced down the gangplank to help him. Get me aboard. Half carried by his first mate, James made it to the deck as the crew frantically worked to get the ship underway. The wind had died completely, the sea around them eerily calm, despite the chaos engulfing the rest of the island. Row if you have to, James ordered weakly. Just get us away from the harbor. He collapsed against the mainmast, the shard still clutched in his bleeding hand, the trident across his lap. With every ounce of remaining strength, he maintained the connection, directing the essence of the deep ones away from their escape route, feeling parts of himself burning away in the process. Hold on. Captain, Thomas urged, tearing a strip from his shirt to bind James's wounded hand. We'll get you home. James smiled grimly through the pain. I don't think I have a home anymore, Thomas. He looked down at his arm, where scales had begun to appear beneath the skin, then back at the disintegrating island. I'm neither of their world, nor fully of ours now. The Redemption inched away from the dock, agonizingly slow without wind to fill her sails. The oars were deployed, men straining at them to put distance between the ship and the harbor. In his mind, James could feel the connection weakening, the ancient hunger of the deep ones surging against his control. They would break free soon, and when they did, their wrath would be terrible. Faster, he whispered, knowing it wouldn't be enough. We need to be farther out to sea. The glowing shard pulsed in rhythm with his fading heartbeat, each surge draining more of his humanity. Each moment of control purchased with pieces of his soul. Artifact, the ocean's tear. A single drop of pure seawater that contains James' humanity, preserved within a pendant so he can maintain his connection to the human world while embracing his dual nature. Through sheer force of will and the last reserves of his strength, James maintained the connection long enough for the Redemption to clear the harbor. Once in open water, something unexpected happened. The sea itself began to move the ship, currents forming beneath the hull to propel them away from the disintegrating island. The water! It's helping us, Thomas observed in disbelief. James nodded weakly. Not the deep ones. Something else. He thought of his mother, of her divided loyalties, of the trident she had ensured would find its way to him. Not all who dwell beneath the waves serve the same masters. Behind them, the island was consumed in chaos. The mountain collapsed entirely, sending massive waves in all directions except the one in which the Redemption fled. The formless horror that had emerged from the temple's ruins sank into the sea, its many eyes still fixed on James until the last moment. It's following beneath us, Daniels reported nervously, watching the water churn in their wake. Keeping pace. It wants what I took from it, James said, holding up the sea glass shard which continued to pulse with blue light, a fragment of its essence. And what it awakened in me, the scales that had begun to appear on his arm had spread, now covering most of his forearm with an iridescent pattern that shifted from blue to green as he moved. The pain had subsided, replaced by a strange numbness and an awareness of the sea that transcended normal human senses. He could feel currents miles distant, sense the passage of great creatures in the deep, hear the whispers of the tide against far shores. "You're changing," Thomas said quietly, kneeling beside his captain. "Like they were changing." "Not the same," James shook his head. "They surrendered to it, became vessels. I'm integrating it, finding balance." He smiled grimly. "At least I'm trying to. Can it be reversed?" James considered the question. The transformation occurring within him felt fundamental, cellular, his body reshaping itself according to blueprints that had been dormant in his blood since birth. Yet he remained himself. His mind was clear, his loyalty to his crew undiminished. "I don't think reversal is possible," he admitted finally. "But perhaps control is." As if in response to his words, the sea glass shard in his hand pulsed once more, then began to dissolve, the essence within it flowing into his wounded palm. Rather than burning as before, it brought relief, the feeling of cool water on parched skin. "Captain," Morris called urgently from the stern. "It's surfacing!" Behind the ship, the water bulged upward as something massive rose from below. Not the chaotic horror from the island, but something more defined, a face formed from the sea itself. Features James recognized with a shock. Isabella, his mother, rendered in living water 20 times human size. "My son," her voice carried across the waves, audible to all aboard, yet somehow intimate, as if she spoke directly into James' mind. "You have wounded them deeply. They retreat to the abyssal trenches to recover, but they will return. They always return." James struggled to his feet, leaning on the trident for support. "What are you truly?" The massive water-face smiled sadly. "We were the guardians before we were the servants, the watchers at the threshold between worlds. Some of us were corrupted, made to serve the deep ones. Others, like me, maintained our purpose, to protect the surface world from what lurks below. And my father, a good man once, seduced by promises of power and immortality. I loved him, James, as I love you. Which is why I left you the means to choose your own path." Her gaze shifted to the trident. "That weapon was forged to bind, not to serve. To control the essence, not surrender to it." "I'm changing," James said, holding up his scaled arm. "Becoming something else. You are becoming what you were always meant to be, a bridge between worlds. Neither fully of the land, nor fully of the sea, but master of both domains." From the massive face, a single drop of water separated, floating across the distance to hover before James. Unlike the surrounding seawater, this droplet was perfectly clear, containing within its tiny sphere a swirling light like a captured star. The ocean's tear, Isabella named it. "The last pure essence uncorrupted by the deep ones. Take it, and your humanity will remain intact even as you embrace your other nature." James hesitated, then reached out, allowing the droplet to fall into his palm alongside the dissolving shard. The two substances, one dark with ancient hunger, one bright with pure life, merged, forming a small, crystalline teardrop that hardened instantly. "Carry this always." Isabella's voice began to fade as her watery form started to dissipate back into the sea. "It will remind you of who you are, of both sides of your heritage." "Wait," James called. "Will I see you again?" The face was almost gone, just ripples on the surface now, but her voice remained for a moment longer. "I am always in the sea, my son, and the sea is in you. We are never truly apart." Then she was gone, the waves settling into normal patterns, though the current continued to push the Redemption swiftly away from where the island had been. No trace of land remained now, just a whirlpool of unnatural size, slowly closing in upon itself. Thomas approached cautiously, eyeing the crystalline teardrop in James's hand. "What now, Captain?" James closed his fingers around the ocean's tear, feeling its coolness spread through him, calming the fire of transformation that had been consuming him. The scales remained, but the burning progression halted. "We sail for home," he decided. "Whatever home means now." He looked out at the horizon, feeling the call of both land and sea within his blood, no longer at war, but in fragile balance. The trident hummed softly in his grip, its power now fully awake, connected to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. "And the deep ones?" Thomas asked. "If they return?" James' gaze hardened as he watched the last traces of the whirlpool disappear. "Then they'll find I'm not so easily corrupted as my father was. The sea has two faces, Thomas, life and death, creation and destruction." He raised the trident, feeling power surge through it in response to his will. "Now so do I.